Always trust.
We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world?
Donedavno je bio jedan od najmoćnijih ljudi u NATO-u. Bio je zapovjednik pomorskih snaga Sjedinjenih Država, zadužen za Evropu i Afriku, te glavnokomandujući Savezničkog zapovjedništva združenih snaga u Napulju. Dobitnik je brojnih priznanja američke, francuske, italijanske i kanadske vlade. U razgovoru za Al Jazeeru, Admiral James Foggo govori o ruskom gomilanju snaga na granici sa Ukrajinom, reakcijama NATO-a, strateškoj važnosti Crnog mora i sigurnosnoj situaciji na Balkanu. Admiral Foggo, hello and welcome to the Al Jazeera Balkans channel. And thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. Now, US President Joe Biden has approved sending additional forces to Eastern Europe as Washington moves to avert a possible Russian invasion of Ukraine. What message is the US sending by ramping up its troop presence in Eastern Europe in countries that are already NATO member states?
Well, Harun, first of all, thank you very much to Al Jazeera for allowing me to come on your program today. And it's great to see you again. And I'm honored to be here as the new Dean of the Center for Maritime Strategy. Now, on the question of the troop buildup in Eastern Europe in nations that surround Ukraine, that's a precautionary measure to mitigate risk. Should the Russians make the bad decision to invade Ukraine, then those allies that are on the border will have an additional NATO troop presence. That's for their security, NATO security, and also to send a message to President Putin that we will not allow any spillover of this conflict into the associated regions of NATO countries who became members in order to take advantage of Article 5 of the NATO Charter.
Right, but how is sending 2,000 American troops to Poland and Germany and shifting 1,000 Germany-based troops to Romania an adequate response to Russia amassing 120,000 troops along Ukraine's borders?
Well, you have to remember that the Poles and the Romanians also have armed forces of their own as NATO members, and these are extremely well-trained forces and very proficient forces. So the presence of additional American troops on Polish soil or Romanian soil is an added benefit for security. And again, it also sends a very strong signal. You also know that the Ukraine is a Partnership for Peace nation and not a member of NATO. And President Zelensky has not asked for a presence of NATO troops in Ukrainian territory. So this is, again, a signal to President Putin and to the Russian Federation that NATO will not be deterred in defending its own contiguous borders of those nations that you just mentioned, and also the Baltic nations who are under some pressure. You also remember that Belarus has allowed the presence of additional Russian troops, and Belarus stirred up a big problem on the border with Poland by allowing illegal migration across the border. So all of these things come into play as Russia tries to pressurize the West, and the West responds to Russian aggressive actions on the ground.
Right, but would you argue for help for NATO countries to help defend Ukraine, a non-NATO member state, either by sending military advisors or lethal weapons? Or, I mean, where do you draw the line between NATO and a non-member state?
Well, there are lethal weapons flowing into Ukraine, and much more so in the last couple of months since this crisis has reached a very high tension. And as far as advisors, there have been some nations that have provided advisors. But as far as boots on the ground and combat troops that might take place in any combat, should Russia cross the line from NATO countries, that is not something that has been on the table for consideration. And again, the reason for that is that Ukraine is not a fully fledged member of NATO. And as you've seen in the media, and you've covered some of this, President Zelensky is, through his rhetoric and through his actions, trying not to exacerbate the situation with the Russian Federation or Russian-backed militias down in Donbass and Luhansk.
Mm-hmm. Now, what do you think are Vladimir Putin's strategic objectives when it comes to Ukraine?
Many security analysts that I spoke to say that it is impossible to occupy perhaps the biggest country in Europe with only 120,000 soldiers. So what is Putin trying to do at this moment?
I think, well, first of all, President Putin and the Russian Federation have invaded Ukraine before. And the popular vernacular is the illegal annexation of Crimea, which took place in 2014. And that was indeed illegal and unfortunate. So he has established a base in Crimea and has pushed Russian-backed militias further to the west into Ukrainian territory, east of the Dnieper River in those areas that we talked about, Donbass and Luhansk. And that has been a frozen conflict for quite some time. Now, all of a sudden, this big buildup on the borders, and nobody but Vladimir Putin knows what will happen next. Should he give the order? That would be a big mistake. What's he trying to do? I think he's trying to preserve a so-called buffer state around the Russian Federation. The Russians lost the territory of Ukraine and became a democratic country after the fall of the Soviet Union back in the 1990s, and has done quite well in trying to bring itself into the family of nations and align with Euro-Atlantic integration. And we all had hoped that this was going to go smoothly for Ukraine. However, the Russians have thrown a wrench into the problem, and they're threatening to expand their borders. I believe that this is part, or I believe that President Putin thinks that this is part of his legacy, and he is driven to get that entire territory back. It's a very dangerous move, and it has tremendous consequences, not only for Russia, also for Ukraine, and also for the rest of the world.
I mean, when you look at this from a broader perspective, how do you make sense of Russia's very aggressive and assertive foreign policy since 2008, since the Russian-Georgian war? I mean, is Vladimir Putin behind all this personally? Is he trying to reincarnate Tsarist Russia? Or is there a clique of former KGB officers who run the show at the Kremlin?
Well, I discount the theory of recreate Tsarist Russia, and I discount the theory of, a clique of elite KGB officers trying to do this. President Putin has goals in mind, and keep in mind he'll be, I think, 70 years old in 2023. He has been a very strong ruler of Russia, and he has taken risk, and he has taken steps that are misaligned with a relationship with the West. Now, after the fall of the Soviet Union, Western Europe, NATO was surprised by President Putin's decision to send his forces into Georgia. And we now see the results of that with this kind of frozen conflict in South Ossetia and Abkhazia. But Georgia remains a sovereign state and continues to function that way, and is also interested in Euro-Atlantic integration and peace in the Black Sea region. After that event in 2008, the West leaned forward to the Russian Federation. And you remember that famous photograph between Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and Minister of Foreign Affairs Sergei Lavrov, who is still there and negotiating today, when they pressed this reset button, right, and we were going to reset the relationship. A lot of things happened as a result of that. There was something called the Russia Work Plan, where American forces and some NATO forces would work with the Russian Federation to establish a peaceful relationship and confidence building measures. And I was in the Pentagon working for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and this was an annual event where the Russia Work Plan would be signed either in Washington or Moscow. And for 365 days a year, there were activities where Russian forces and American forces or NATO forces would come together. I was commander of Baltops in 2015 and 2016. Russian forces weren't invited because of the illegal annexation of Ukraine, but they had been part of that up until that point. And then President Putin celebrated what was a spectacular Olympics in 2014. At the time, we actually had a couple of American ships in the Black Sea to provide for Olympic security. And we even had communications with the Black Sea Fleet commander. When, once again, we were surprised by the Russian invasion of the Crimea, all of that stopped. And it's gotten worse and worse and worse. And diplomatic relations have been very, very difficult because because a number of Russian diplomats have been ejected from this country. Likewise, the same in Moscow for American diplomats. The NATO-Russia dialogue stalled for a while. It's come back into play to try to mitigate this crisis. And so we're in a bit of a mess right now. But I will tell you this, I have never seen the alliance stick so strongly together for a crisis or tension in Eastern Europe as I have in the last couple of months with this crisis on the horizon.
That was exactly my next question.
People are rising to the occasion, they're supporting Ukraine, and they're sending troops to Eastern Europe to restore and replenish our eastern flank.
Has this crisis reinvigorated NATO as an alliance?
Absolutely, yes. There has been measures and steps taken to provide a higher risk. This is all about risk calculus, right? So if the Russian Federation or President Putin thinks that the risk is worth of the cost of an invasion, and those risks we have made very, very high. But if he thinks it's a minimal risk, he'll take that risk and he'll move on the country of Ukraine. What's happened is we have, as a family of nations in NATO and the United States, part of NATO, provided some lethal aid. You've seen the Javelin anti-tank weapon. You've covered it on the news. Other networks have covered it on the news.
Right.
If there were an invasion, there'd be a lot of armor coming across, and there'd be a lot of casualties on both sides of this campaign. Russian casualties, Ukrainian casualties, and civilian casualties. Totally unacceptable. But that increases the risk calculus, and it makes it tougher for the Russians to make a decision to go into Ukraine. Other things have happened too. This family of economic sanctions is some of the largest and the most hard-hitting of any of the sanctions that Russia will have levied upon them since the illegal annexation of Ukraine. We're talking about kicking them out of the SWIFT banking system. This is going to devastate the Russian economy, and you've seen their stock market take a dive in the last month as there are concerns and worries about what this is going to do to the economy. You know, Russia's economy is founded, really, it's a one-trick pony, as we'd say here in the United States. It's based on the ability of the Russian Federation to sell oil and gas. And these sanctions are going to hurt, and they're going to hurt badly. And there is consensus on that amongst NATO partners and allies. And I'm very happy that we're sticking together.
Right. When you listen to Kremlin officials or President Putin himself, do you see Russia's security demands as having any basis? Are they justified in any way whatsoever?
In my opinion, absolutely not. There is no basis for concern for the Russian Federation's security because NATO has moved further to the east. First of all, and foremost, NATO is a defensive alliance. And as far as that goes in the charter, we don't have any provisions in the Washington Treaty of 1949, the charter for NATO, to offensively take anybody else's sovereign territory. So these concerns are unfounded, and they're somewhat paranoid, in my opinion. There is no basis for concern should the Ukraine become a NATO country eventually, but they're not. They're a Partnership for Peace nation. And after joining the Partnership for Peace to help reform their armed forces and bring them up to 21st century standards, there's another step in the process called a membership action plan, where NATO countries will go in and they will try to help those armed forces become agile and flexible and do things that are intended to be defensive in orientation so they can protect their own borders and not go across and take somebody else's territory. And after that very long period of a MAP plan, membership action plan, there is then consideration by the North Atlantic Council and all of NATO as to whether or not a country should become a member of NATO. We just went through this with the 30th member with the Republic of Macedonia, and it became apparent that they were ready and they were brought on board. So I don't see anything like membership for Ukraine happening in the near term. So this statement that there's some threat against the Russian Federation because of that is just a specious statement, an excuse, and demands that NATO back away from new members are completely unacceptable. So these have been set almost like Russian red lines, and they're hoping we don't meet them so they have an excuse to do something else like kinetic activity or an attack on the ground. Again, very dangerous, and there will be severe punishment for that.
Right. Let's talk a little bit about Germany. Many were surprised and, in fact, even shocked, to say the least, when Germany refused overflight permits to the British Air Force that was flying weapons to Ukraine. It also refused to provide export licenses to a number of Baltic states to export their German-made weapons to Ukraine. Why is Germany so hesitant to take a firm stance?
Well, I had tremendous admiration for German Chancellor Angela Merkel, and she has moved on now, and we have a new German Chancellor in Otto Scholz. And so the Chancellor is just getting going. He's trying to meet the demands of his coalition, and he has some of his own economic and security concerns. Obviously, Germany is an economy now that they have secured or shut down the ability to make energy from its civilian nuclear propulsion plants or power plants. They depend on oil and gas. And so that Nord Stream 2 pipeline is as important to Germany as it is to the Russian Federation. So making these decisions have been difficult decisions for Germany. And looking at it through the lens of their eyes, believe me, I don't agree with some of the things that the Germans have done, but looking at it through the lens of their eyes, in fairness, they are taking some actions so as not to exacerbate the relationship that they have with the Russian Federation. And the new chancellor has tried to reach out and establish a more diplomatic relationship with the Russian Federation and specifically President Putin. So that's the reason I think they did it, but it's out of step with the vast majority of other NATO allies and partners who have taken measures to punish Russia should they make the mistake of invading Ukraine.
Right. Let's talk a little bit about the Balkans. You have been here quite a number of times. I remember your last visit, I believe, was in 2019. There is increasing talk of war in Bosnia and Herzegovina should Milorad Dodik and the Republic of Srpska push ahead with their plans to break away and declare independence. Bearing in mind that Bosnia borders with Croatia, a NATO member state, and Montenegro, a NATO member state, among others. Is this something that worries you?
Absolutely worries me, but as far as something that might turn into a war, I don't think that we're there yet. I think that it's very important that Bosnia-Herzegovina join this family of nations and achieve, the majority of the people there want to achieve their dream of someday becoming a NATO member and moreover becoming a member of the European Union, which has tremendous economic value for the country. And unfortunately, they have a tri-presidency, so all the different ethnicities and parties are represented. And in the Republic of Srpska, they have President Milorad Dodik. Of all the times, and as you know, we met one time when I was out there in Sarajevo. I spent probably one trip a month or every other month going to the countries of the Balkans, primarily in Kosovo, where we had a large troop presence, with Americans and NATO forces, about 4,000 troops to maintain the peace between Kosovar Albanians and Serbia on the other side. And that's been tense since 1999 with its ups and downs. But this activity by Milorad Dodik to try to create a separate sovereign state of the Republic of Srpska is counterproductive for all of Bosnia-Herzegovina. It's going to hurt them. It's going to hurt them economically. It's going to hurt them as far as their desire to join the NATO alliance. And that's his charter. That's what he's trying to prevent. And in my humble opinion, I think somebody else is pulling the strings on this. And it has connectivity to the Russian Federation, just like President Lukashenko and some of his actions in Belarus. At one time at my headquarters in Joint Forces Command, Naples, for the southern flank of NATO, we had Belarusian liaison officers in and out. They were not given access to classified spaces, but the intent was, and the hope was that, we'd be able to have some kind of a mill-to-mill relationship and that area would remain at least neutral, if not, pro-Western. And it appeared that, that might be happening. They actually as observers, came to the largest NATO exercise since the end of the Cold War, Trident Juncture, which I commanded back in 2018. So I had high hopes for this relationship with Belarus, and it's gone the other way. And I fear that the Republic of Srpska and the lead by President Dodik could cause the same kinds of problems in Bosnia-Herzegovina. And that's affecting not just the Republic of Srpska, but the rest of Bosnia-Herzegovina. It's hurting the other representative entities that are there who want something better for their lives, their children, and their families. And that is indeed unfortunate.
Right, but to what extent is the Balkan region important to the transatlantic alliance? I mean, most of the countries have joined the alliance. In fact, all of them have joined NATO except for Bosnia, Serbia, and Kosovo.
It's very important, Iran, because let's face it, we've had wars begin because of actions that were taken in the region. And you know the story, as do many of you viewers, about the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 1914 on the bridge in Sarajevo. And while that individual act did not cause the First World War, the events surrounding that act and the aftermath of that act led to, you know, one of the most heinous wars with the largest number of casualties in a long time. It was terrible. I have two grandfathers that fought in that war on the side of the Commonwealth, and you know, we don't want to go back to something like that again. So obviously this is an important region to try to keep peace and to execute and practice diplomacy and to take into account the interests of all parties that are there in order to maintain some modicum of satisfaction for everybody. And that's tough because, you know, as far as common ground, it can be watered down to the least common denominator. You're never going to please everybody, but it is important not to go that extra step and start fighting or start shooting at one another. That is why we have that presence of NATO troops in Kosovo. That is why we have a NATO mission in Sarajevo. You know, I was around in the Pentagon in 2003 and made several trips to the region. I've been doing Balkans for a long time. There was a stabilization force, and we made a decision to draw down that stabilization force and turn over to the European Union and U4. And today that operation or that headquarters is called Althea. Whenever I went into Sarajevo, I'd visit my NATO headquarters and then walk down the hall and spend time with the commander of Althea. I had a liaison office with the EU in my office in Naples, Italy. So it's not just important to NATO, it's important to Europe writ large to keep peace in that region. That's why we make that capital investment. And that's why we talk to the Serbs and we talk to the Kosovar Albanians, and we try to make sure that peace reigns in Pristina and across the border in Belgrade. It's really, really important.
Can NATO beef up its military presence in the region should things begin to slide out of control?
NATO can easily beef up its military presence anywhere in the regions of its contiguous borders of its 30 members if there is tension. And there's all sorts of ways and articles to do that in the Washington Treaty, Article 3, Article 4, Article 5. Article 5 is a last-ditch effort where an attack on one is an attack on all. And I'll tell you, the alliance has maintained peace for a very long time because the only time Article 5 was ever used was during 9/11, an attack on the United States of America. And it was declared, and European partners and allies came to assist us in places where violent extremist organizations existed. You know, one of those places was Afghanistan. And when we're talking about, risk in the Ukraine and the Russians crossing the border into Ukraine, I'm absolutely dumbfounded by the fact that the Russians, may not be paying attention to that famous phrase by Santayana, that those who ignore history risk repeating it. And in recent history, up until 1979, the Russians were beat in a protracted war in Afghanistan, and they departed, and it went badly for them. The exit from Afghanistan last year did not go well for the United States of America. It's known as the graveyard of empires, right? Well, could that happen in the Ukraine over a protracted conflict? I don't think 100,000 troops is enough to try to go in and take territory and hold territory in the Ukraine. There's going to be a fight. The Ukrainians are going to fight bravely, and they're going to incur a lot of casualties on the Russian side. And that's got to be taken into account, as well as all these punishing and crippling economic sanctions. So just a bad move overall. And, you know, if President Putin ever asked me, I'd tell him not to do it, but he doesn't ask me.
Right. Admiral Foggo, it's a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you so much for your time.
Ron, thank you and the listeners of Al Jazeera. And I got to tell you this, you know, wherever I was in the Pentagon, I always had 4 stations that I would watch. It was Al Jazeera, CNN, Fox, and BBC. And that gave me the political left, the political right. It told me what was going on in, you know, Arabic nations and all the nations that Al Jazeera reaches across the world. And you guys do really important work, and your reporting is fair and accurate. So thanks for that. Keep up the good work. And I look forward to doing this with you again.
All right. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Bye-bye.